He's a freelance writer, a guitarist, editor, and senior producer for Afropop worldwide. He's also a contributor to NPR and recently the author of the just-released book, a biography about Zimbabwe's Chimurenga music guru, Lion Songs, Thomas Mapfumo, and the music that made Zimbabwe. This is a personal journal of a journey that has taken Banning Eyre close to 25 years to put together. Banning, welcome to SaharaTV.
Thank you, thank you. It's great to be here, Fungai.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight into, you say in the book, this is the book that tells stories of an artist and a nation with music as the thread that binds them together. You also say, for in the end, there's no way to understand Thomas Mapfumo without understanding Zimbabwe, and no better to know Zimbabwe than through the examination of life and work of Thomas Mapfumo. How long have you known Thomas Mapfumo for?
Well, I met Thomas in 1988, so it's 27 years ago, when I went to Zimbabwe to do research for Afropop worldwide. And it was a powerful experience for me because I knew Eyre music from the time that I was in university at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and we heard a lot of music from Africa. And I was fascinated by Eyre music just simply as a music. I knew nothing about its significance in Shona culture or history. And when I first heard recordings in the early 80s of Mapfumo's early stuff, and I heard that music being played on guitar, I was just fascinated by it. And so to meet him was a big thrill, just on a musical level. But then, and I became very interested in trying to learn to play that guitar style. And, we did long interviews with him on that first visit.
So I know in the beginning of the book, you speak of differences between cultures in reference to Western and African. And then our coach, he says we have different cultures, Banning. We can work together, but we can never be the same. And we must protect that difference. How was this experience to hear him say that to you?
I really kind of admired just the clarity and honesty of that statement, because I knew that to be true. I knew that, I've done a lot of writing about Africa. I wrote an earlier book about Mali, and it was a similar kind of thing where when you're an outsider and you're writing about a culture that's not your own, you have, I think I say this also in the book, you have certain advantages and disadvantages. The advantage you have is that you don't assume you know anything. So you dig deep and you try to understand, you talk to as many people as you can, because you know that you're not an insider, and you can never have the kind of inside knowledge that someone who's grown up in that culture has. So you know that you have to work harder. And you also know that you're never going to be an insider. You're never going to be 100% there. So you work hard to get as close as you can, knowing. And when he said that, we have to protect our difference, I respected that. I thought that's really true. That's a very honest statement.
You also say, of course, this book is both enriched and hobbled by that difference.
Exactly.
Now, you also say, our quote, this is the work of an outsider with access, a lifelong fan, searching for truth in a world, it must be acknowledged, he can never fully understand. So you've just explained that. But then in your numerous times that you visited Zimbabwe, you obviously moved with Thomas, you worked with Thomas, you played with Thomas in some songs, and you have this background knowledge of who the man is. And they called you Murewa, which was a nickname they gave you in Zimbabwe. So Thomas Mapfumo, that's not his real name. You mentioned in the book that was his actual maternal grandfather's name that he adopted. Can you tell us about how you got to learn that?
Sure. Well, I mean, Thomas's story is made complex by the complexity of Zimbabwe's history and the whole transition from southern Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. But it also is complicated by the nature of his own family, because his biological father did not have enough money to marry his mother. And so for the first 10 years of his life, while she was you know, working out her own life in the city and marrying Mr. Mapfumo, who is not Thomas's biological father. Thomas lived with her family in Marondera. And so he was out in the communal lands having this very rural life, you know, taking care of cattle and doing, you know, farming tasks, and hearing Mbira music in its context in Ngoma and the kinds of village music. All these things are very, very deep into him from his childhood, this rural childhood. It's really important to understand that, because you think of him as a very urban character, you know, Mbare,
Highfield.
Yeah, sure. All these places that are like, were like the bedrock performance places for the Blacks Unlimited for all those years. But that rural education that he had, I think, is a really, really crucial thing to understand in order to really deeply understand his message.
Okay, so your personal involvement obviously just did not leave you on the stages or backstages of Thomas Mapfumo's concerts. You moved around Zimbabwe, in the villages, in Chitungwiza, you mentioned, in Seke. You went to Murewa, you went to Dande. You hung around Zimbabwean musicians like the great Effort Mujuru, who was also a musical genius in terms of the Mbira music.
Absolutely.
You attended some of their Mbiras, which are all-nighters, you know, where they invoke the spirits to come through. Now, Thomas Mapfumo's music has the Mbira as one of the central instrument that you hear, and then the guitar picking, imitating the Mbira. What was your experience? Because I remember Thomas Mapfumo also in your book, you know, the first time you heard one of his guitarists pick the Mbira on his guitar and imitate that sound. What was your first experience to, you know, relate to that kind of playing?
Well, for me, it actually started when the producer of Afropop, Sean Barlow, sent me a cassette from London in 1984 that had a bunch of African music, including early Mapfumo songs. And for me, because I already loved the sound of Mbira, to hear it played on guitar was thrilling, exciting, fascinating. It could really suck me in. But I know from all the interviews and research I've done since that for people, Zimbabweans, in the context of the 1970s especially, where they were fighting this very, very difficult war, that was both a political war but also a cultural war, because it was about redeeming culture, and the way that had been so stigmatized by Rhodesian education and missionaries, and, you know, seeing Shona religion as evil and all this kind of stuff. To hear this music brought forward that way, I know was incredibly powerful for people, and you know, I interviewed some Mbira players in the book who seemed to really believe not just that this was a kind of a very brilliant show business thing to do for Thomas, but that he actually was in touch with spirits and was in effect a kind of spirit medium, and he never made that claim, and you know, he never has, but it was so powerful that regardless of what he said, many people just believed that, it seems.
I mean, I've been to many of his concerts back in Zimbabwe and also here in America, and I've seen audiences captivated by that mystique, mystery that he brings when he's on stage with the band. Talking about other musicians, you spoke to the late great Mbira female player, Bula Joko, who, in the mysterious world of the Mbira, she was actually summoned by the spirits to pick up that instrument and play. And this is from a place called Dande. So I think in what you write, she had this claim, obviously, that she was summoned by the gods. And Thomas started off as a pop kind of music playing, imitating guy, Elvis Presley, Ray Charles. And then the switch came later on, where after he discovered that he needed to go back to his roots, he centralized his music, you know, to speak about the struggle that was going on, and also utilize these African instruments to be the central. So Beulah sort of like takes a swipe, according to how you put it in the book. How did you feel from that conversation that you had from what she was trying to say?
Well, I mean, I think that any time a popular artist takes, you know, old religious material, you could find narratives like this in Haiti or Cuba or many places in Africa, it's problematic. You know, people who live and breathe this religion and who see themselves as spiritual people engaged in a spiritual life, seeing that music taken into beer halls and people dancing and mixed in with other kinds of music and electric instruments and all of that, it's inevitably problematic, and there are going to be people who have a problem with it. And but it's really remarkable when you look at Thomas's whole career, how almost universally accepted and praised he is now. I mean, I did meet some beer players that were a little bit skeptical about that, or, you know, none who were really like openly critical of it, but yeah, you know, he knows what he's doing, Tute Chigamba says at one point.
Right.
But most of them are incredibly appreciative for what he did, just because it valorized the culture. It brought it forward in a way that people could really respect it and understand it. And you have, I mean, one of the big points I try to get across in the book that really seems important to me is that the nature of colonialism in Rhodesia was different than Ghana or Nigeria or other places where the English operated in Africa. They were because they wanted to live there, they were very concerned with manipulating people culturally and getting inside their heads and making them ashamed of that kind of culture. And Thomas, as much as his messages have been political, I think his cultural message that you have to, you know, try to figure out how to deal with that and how to decode and deconstruct and deprogram that really pernicious aspect of Rhodesian rule is you know, an ongoing task. It's not solved yet. It's something that still has to be worked through, and I think that's really one of his most important messages.
Okay, so you also obviously put through the Chimurenga music aspect, because then Chimurenga was obviously the war between the Rhodesians and the Zimbabwean freedom fighters, or, you know, people that helped liberate the country. And then fast forward, after we got liberated, Thomas continued to stand for justice, for peace, and he was not afraid to call it out the way he saw it. And as a result, he's actually in exile. Here, self-exile, I'll put it in Oregon, in the United States. He continues to play and sing music that's obviously standing against the authorities and denouncing some of the bad stuff that he sees. So now this book is out. How has this been received? I know it's just a couple of weeks that it's been out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of too early to say. I haven't really, there have only been a couple of reviews so far. And everyone who I know who knows Thomas, who has read the book, and that's just a handful of people now, they seem to like it very well. I've had a lot of good feedback from people who are fans and who are close to the music and who've read it, because I think it's an unusual book in the way that, I mean, I told you that originally I became fascinated with the music, but knowing Thomas, I started to see that whole idea that the way you have to understand Thomas, you have to understand Zimbabwe, and the way to understand Zimbabwe through Thomas and his music is a very powerful. I mean, just to see how all the touch points along the way where his songs and his ideas and things that he did just crystallized various moments in history. I thought, if you can tell the story of the man, the music, and the birth of this nation together, and I think that's an unusual approach to take. I can't think of too many. I can't really think of any other book that's quite does that. So that was its unique mission.
This was quite a researched book, according to me, because I've read it and I've seen the connections and the efforts that you've put trying to explain it to a novice, because sometimes to explain Mbira and the connection to Mbira, you know, you have to start from somewhere. So in your own words, you've managed to do that. So I really, you know, feel like it's been 25 years of hard work putting together a history. Obviously, you cannot put everything inside in one book, but this is exactly your efforts. Now, what would you tell the people that need to pick up this book? What would be your message? Well, in a nutshell.
I mean, I wrote this book for everyone, but the principal audience I wrote it for is people who really don't know anything about this, and that's why I had to really try to figure out how to explain it to someone who didn't grow up with any of this stuff. But at the same time, I wanted it to be deep enough and detailed enough and well-researched enough, talking to the right people about each thing, that someone like yourself, who's very close to many aspects of this, growing up in Zimbabwe, would also find it, both interesting and respectful, because, what we talked about in the beginning, being an outsider, you're always in this kind of awkward position. Right. So I guess the real message that I have is sort of what Musa Zimunia says, the poet, right at the beginning of the book, about how people undervalue the power of music in history. It gets overlooked far too much, and it's hugely important and hugely revealing. And this is a story where you can really see how a musician affects history and reflects history, and really gives you a way of understanding a culture, politics, religion, spiritual life, social life, all these things. It's so much more than just the story of an entertainer or of a series of popular songs, or it's all of that, but it's something much deeper. And I hope that people come away with this book with a new respect for how powerful music is as a way of understanding the world.
Okay, so where can people pick up the copy of this book?
It
comes obviously with a CD and some kind
CD,
of
right. There it is.
Discussions and conversations.
Yeah, right there. The CD it's the only compilation that really goes through his entire canon, starting from 1974 right up to 2010. And I did include little clips of interviews that crystallize and give you a sense of his personality. Because again, I wanted people who've never thought about Thomas or heard of him to be able to get a sense of the scope. But you can get it. You can get it many places. You can get the CD on CD Baby. You can get all these things at my website, banningeyre.com. But I think the book is now also available on Amazon just as of this week, I think, or last week. So it's out there. You can find it. And if you have any trouble, you can just email me at banning@afropop.org.
Okay, that's what we had time for today. Thank you, Banning Eyre, for coming on to our show. And obviously, we're going to be reading the book and also look forward to further performances. You played with people in Mali and all over the world, so we'll be watching. This is Fungai Maboreke. Stay tuned. Next week we're going to bring you Thomas Mapfumo himself to speak to us about this book. Stay tuned.